Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce myself. You've heard my name, Cantor Matan Meital, or in Hebrew, Chazzan Matan. I live in West Rogers Park, and so it was a long journey down here to Oak Park. Just kidding. But I'm really glad to be here with you. I was born and raised in Jerusalem. You might have heard a slight accent in my Hebrew as I was davening. And I grew up in the Israeli conservative movement, in the Masorti movement, went to camp in the Masorti movement. So I grew up in a conservative egalitarian spirit, which is not typical in Israel. But coming to America, there was much easier to find a home. And I see some old and some new friendly faces today. Growing up, I was leading services, and I was always musical, and I had the very great pleasure and honor to study with Cantor David Brandhandler, who was a cantor at Ner Tamid up in Rogers Park. And then I had to work. I had to figure out what I wanted to do. I fell into healthcare. It was a good profession, but I always had sustainability as part of my values. Growing up in Israel, not having a lot of resources, it's something that was drilled into us. Conserve, conserve, conserve. Conserve water, use solar for heating your water. So conservation and sustainability was always top of mind. And so for me, at least naturally, also in terms of having Jewish values, we talked about yesterday about sustainability. For those who were at the dinner, it was very natural for me to go into sustainability and pursue a path and a career in clean energy, which is what I do now. And so I went back to school and got an engineering and a business degree, and I look forward to talking to you later today at the luncheon about the intersectionality of some Jewish thoughts that are related to Shavuot, which we just celebrated last week, and to what I do, which is energy storage. It might not seem related, but I try to find some association. What I'd like to talk about very briefly today, not about the parasha, I gave us a few words about the parasha yesterday, but about the haftarah, about what was so beautifully read by Dale, right? Dale, thank you. I'm trying to remember names. And read so beautifully. And it's the story of Samson. For those of you who are not familiar with Samson, it's a unique story in the Bible because it is a story where we have a superhero, for all intents and purposes. We have a gentleman named Samson who becomes a Nazirite, doesn't have any grape or alcoholic drinks, doesn't cut his hair, is declared, as we read today, before his birth, to be a Nazirite and to be a savior to the Jewish people. That is in juxtaposition to what the portion said, which we read today, about a Nazirite who chooses to be a Nazirite for a specific amount of time. Samson was declared before his birth for his whole life. And then he becomes this superhero, this Ubermensch. And nowhere else do we read that. Now, I promised for those last night that I was going to talk about solar today as well, in some shape or form. And that comes to us from the name of Samson in Hebrew, Shimshon, Who knows the word for sun in Hebrew? Shemesh. Isn't that interesting? I thought so. I thought so when I read an article in high school about Samson being based on a Greek tragedy. Now that makes sense actually if you think about it. Samson is from the tribe of Dan. Dan were seafarers. If you go in the biblical criticism path versus the literal path that they were all tribes descended from Jacob, then the tribe of Dan came somewhere from the sea. Now, who are they fighting? The Philistines. The Philistines, does anyone have an idea of where they came from? Cyprus, thank you. They came from Greece. They brought the Greek faith and the Greek mythology with them. And there have been many comparisons between Samson and Hercules, because of this really strong man. And the way that Samson's birth is heralded by this angel makes us think of the oracles in Delphi when the parents or the royals would go and ask for the future. So there are parallels. Now specifically Samson, and specifically the Philistines, who were Phoenicians, they had a sun cult. And so that's where the name Samson comes. So I find that fascinating, and I promised a connection with solar, that our Haftarah, that our Bible borrows, for all intents and purposes, a story from Greek mythology, and it follows the Greek hero's tragedy arc. Announced almost like an oracle, born in extraordinary circumstances, grows up as an extraordinary person, and yet, again, as the portion, the Nazarite, is trying to get closer to God and chooses to be a Nazarite, Samson was not given that choice, and he is ruled by his own impulses. If we look at his story, all of his conflicts with the Philistines are self-involved. He doesn't go on a national campaign. It's all about things that happen to him and his rivals, and he follows his own desires, his own emotions, and then he follows his wife Delilah. Like Hercules' demise was by his wife, who put a sort of poison on the Nemean lion fur that he wore every day, which burned him alive and killed him. Here, Samson, his wife, cuts his hair. Now, I'm not saying anything against women. I'm just saying the story. So don't hold that against me. I'm just pointing out the similarities. His wife cuts his hair, the source of his strength, and he becomes basically helpless. And I find that just very, very fascinating. And I wanted to share that with you because yesterday we were talking about changing the way we perceive the text and finding new and deeper meaning by changing our perspective. And if we look at the story of Samson as a story that originates in another culture, which, by the way, the story of Noah and the flood originates in the Akkadian, Babylonian, Enuma Elish story of creation. Utnapishtim is the counterpart. So it's not, and we have Leviathan as a big, great behemoth in the water, and that was considered to be Marduk, who was descended from the great dragon, again in Enuma Elish. But what we have is a sanitized Jewish version because, as we read, the Jews and the Israelites were always besotted by external influences, the golden calf, for example. And so as opposed to deny that these relationships existed, they're there, but they become ingested, digested, cleansed, monotheized in a way that the Jewish tradition finds appropriate. So instead of being descended from gods, Samson is described as a deliverer. What is the source of his strength? His vows as a Nazarite. So there's always this connection to God. What is his downfall? That as opposed to what a Nazarite should be, from what we read today, striving to be closer to God, thinking about the community, Samson followed his own emotions and own desires, and that brought his downfall. But as opposed to the Greek tragedy, Samson dies like a Greek hero, but unlike a Greek hero, he repents at the end when he is chained by the Philistine and brought out while they are having this banquet so that they can ridicule him. He stands between two pillars. They had gouged out his eyes. He repents. He cries to God. God gives him a last bout of strength, and he brings down, he collapses the pillars with his bare hands and literally brings down the house on the Philistines. And so in the end, we have this return to God, what the moral of the Nazarite story is trying to tell us. And so again, through this connection with the natural world, because it comes from a solar cult, if we look beyond the first level, where the pagans worshipped the sun, what is behind the sun? It is the greater power of God. What is the reason that we have these abilities? We talked about how we are creating power from solar, which is extraordinary if you think about it. Is again our connection to our community. Samson did not serve his community until the end. If we serve our community, if we realize our connection to God, that is the true message, the true Jewish message in this story versus the connection to the Cypriot Phoenicians, Philistines. So hopefully we can take this lesson, not ignore or whitewash history, right? We're learning that lesson these days. Acknowledge history, but acknowledge the lessons we can learn and what are the ways that we can improve ourselves and our communities moving forward. Shabbat Shalom.